The Nightly Quest by Tennessee Williams. When Governor Pierce returned home after years of travel with a tutor companion, the late Dr. Horace Greaves, everything visible from the airport, including the airport itself, was so unrecognizable to him that he thought the plane must have made an unscheduled stop. He was about to hurry back up the steps to the plane's cabin when he heard the voice of a woman calling his name. He gazed out toward the direction from which the call issued, and what he saw was a young woman approaching him with the velocity of a football tackler and with a mink coat flapping about her. For a couple of moments, she was intercepted and restrained in her approach by a pair of armed guards. Hands off! Hands off me! Don't you know who I am? I'm Mrs. Braden Pierce, out here to meet the brother of my husband. His name's Governor, the same as the name of the town. The steel-helmeted guards fell back from her with awkward little deferential salutes, and then she continued her rush toward Governor, who defended and braced himself as best he could by placing vertically before him his furled black silk umbrella, and tensing his slight body to withstand the moment of impact. But he was surprised and relieved that this young wife of his brother, never seen before, slackened her pace just before she reached him. And instead of colliding with him, she introduced herself to him in a manner that was fast and vigorous, but reasonably coherent. "Oh, Governor," she cried out to him, as if he were in a far corner of the airfield. "I bet you don't know who I am. I am Braden's wife, Violet, and Mother Pierce, God love her, was dying to meet you herself, but she just couldn't make it because today is the day she's placing a wreath on the memorial to our boys in Quat Sing Hau. And so, God love her, she appointed me in her place to welcome you here." "Oh, good," said Governor. They were now moving toward the airport building, Violet still holding up her end of the unilateral conversation. "How was your flight? Was it nice? I recognized you the moment you started down the steps from the plane. Not because you look like your brother, Braden, but you don't a bit in the world, but you did look exactly the way I expected you to look. I swear you did. And you do." "How did you expect me to look?" asked Governor with unaffected interest in what her answer might be. He had a touch of the Narcissan in his nature, and was always somewhat curious about the way he might appear to persons unaccustomed to his appearance. "Why, I know the family called you Prince. They did and still do. And if anybody ever looked like a prince out of a fairy tale book, it's you. God love you, you do." Then, without pause, she cried out, "Oh my God, they're playing Babe Stomp again." "Playing what?" asked Governor. "Baby Babe Babe, the president's daughter, you know." "No, I don't know," said Governor. "Well, first there was Babe's Hop, and now there's Babe's Stomp. And I want you to know that as much as I detested the hop, this stomp of hers makes the hop seem like a lovely thing to look back on. It actually does, no fooling." Violet was referring to rhythm band music that was coming thunderously from a sound apparatus atop the terminal building. It made the airport sound like a big discotheque, and several incoming passengers and persons there to receive them were going into spastic stamping gyrations. Governor shouted over this hullabaloo. "What's wrong with the air?" he shouted. "It has a peculiar smell to it." "Oh, that," shouted Violet. "That's just the fumes from the project." "What's the project?" Governor shouted back at her. Shouting was unnecessary now, for Babe Stomp had quit as abruptly as it had started. Governor's shouted question drew undesired attention in the sudden comparative silence. People glanced at him with expressions of curiosity or incredulity or both. Out of the side of her mouth, Violet said, "No talk about it right now." And she called out the name William. "William?" A deadpan, uniformed man, presumably employed by the family, emerged from the airport crowd to take Gavinner's baggage claim checks. "Now then," said Violet, "we'll go wait in the car and get acquainted. Unless you could use a wee drink at the bar. Frankly, I hope you can. I could sure as hell use a stinger under my belt. Whenever I rush about, it makes me thirsty. So come along, Prince. Right up these steps here to the little skylight lounge. You know, you know, we're all so excited that you come home from your travels. Let's sit at the bar. It's quicker. Now, where were you last in your travels?" "In the land of the midnight sun," said Gavinner, knowing from the wild but glazed look in her eyes that she'd pay no attention to this answer, which was made up. Where he'd last been in his travels was actually in Manhattan, where his tutor companion, Dr. Greaves, had fallen fatally prey to an overdosage of a drug he'd taken to expand his perceptions. This drug had not only expanded the perceptions of Dr. Greaves, but had deranged them somewhat, so that the good gray philosopher and doctor of humanities had walked right off the roof of a 5-story brownstone in the Turtle Bay section of Manhattan, as if he were responding to a call from outer space, which may have been exactly what he was doing. In the cocktail lounge at the airport, Gavinner asked for a Campari and soda, but didn't get it, the drink being unknown to the barman. Violet showed a somewhat assertive streak in her nature by telling the barman to give them both stingers. She tossed down hers as fast as if she were putting out a fire in her stomach. And then she said to Gavinner, "Why, Prince, you didn't drink enough of that stinger to keep a bird alive." "Oh well, I'll finish it for you." So she tossed down Gavinner's stinger too. "Now then," she said, "that's what the doctor ordered, and I obeyed the order. So let's make a run for the car before the family suspects we've been up here, Gavinner." In the car on the way home, if home you could call it, Gavinner continued to observe almost nothing he had once known in the town, which had now grown to a city. The sylvan park, whose trees had been mostly willows, had turned into a concrete playground, full of monkeys disguised as children. At least that was the impression made upon Gavinner. To himself more than to Violet, he observed, "I remember it being like a romantic ballet setting. I mean, swans drifted about on a lake, and there were cranes, herons, flamingos, and even a peacock with several peahens around him. But now there's not a willow and not a swan, or a lake for a swan to drift in." "Ah, now," said Violet, "you mustn't philosophize gloomily about it." "I wasn't philosophizing. I was simply remembering and observing," said Gavinner. He gave Violet a rather sharp glance, wondering where she had gotten her education, if any. "I reckon you don't realize it," said Violet, pressing his arm as if to comfort him. "But all these changes you notice are because of the project." "And what exactly is that?" asked Gavinner again. "Prince, you're not serious, are you?" "Perfectly. I've never heard of the project." "Well, now you have," said Violet. "And furthermore, you're just about to see it. The outside of it. There. Here. Look at it." The limousine was now going by what appeared to be an enormous penitentiary for criminals of the most dangerous nature. Its grounds were enclosed by a tall metal fence on which, at intervals, were signs that said, "Danger, electrically charged." And just inside this enclosure, patrolling the grounds, were uniformed men with dogs. The dogs seemed to want to go faster than the men, They kept tugging at their leads and glancing back crossly at the men. Then the dogs would look ahead again with expressions that could be described as fiercely glaring. The men's and dogs' heads would pivot slightly from right to left and left to right, as if the men and dogs had gone to the same training school and come out equally proficient at the art of patrolling. And it would be hard to say, if you had to, which glared more fiercely, the human guards or the dogs. "Why, here," said Giviner, almost exclaiming about it, "was my father's business, the Red Devil battery plant." "Yes, isn't it wonderful?" said Violet, with a certain sibilance in her speech. "Your father's. God love your father. His Red Devil battery plant has been converted into the project. And I want you to know that your brother, Braden Pierce, is the top man on the totem pole here. And it's not just great, it's the greatest." "What does the project make or do?" asked Gaviner. "Oh, I do love you, Prince," cried out Violet. "To think you honestly don't know what the project is for." "Why, Prince, it's for the development of a thing to blow them all off the map of the world, for good and all and forever." "Who is them?" "Why, them is them. Who else?" "Are you serious, Prince? Or are you just putting me on about it?" He heard a quick scratching sound and saw that she had snatched a little appointment book from her purse and was scribbling down something. She tore the page out and pressed it into his hand. The message was, "Change the subject. I think this car is bugged." Gaviner had hardly read this peculiar message when Violet snatched the paper back from him, crumpled it, thrust it into her mouth, ground it between her teeth, swallowed, gagged, coughed, pressed a button that turned the radio on, clutched her throat, and swallowed again, this time successfully. Immediately after this curious series of actions, or compulsive syndrome, she began to chatter again. "Prince? Gaviner?" I wish you could have seen the delighted expression on their faces, Mama's and Braden's, when they heard you were on your way back here all of a sudden. It was a sight to behold, that I can tell you. Oh, here we are. Recognize it? The car had turned into the drive of a gray stone building that had a resemblance, probably more deliberate than accidental, to something in the nature of an ancient Saracen castle brought up to date. "It's all that I've recognized since I got off the plane," said Gaviner, telling almost the truth. Without asking questions, just by listening to and piecing together scraps of conversation, Gaviner came to know in the following days a number of things that accounted for the town's changes, such as the fact that his late father's Red Devil battery plant had sure enough been converted into a thing called the Project, and that the Project was engaged all day and all night in the development of some marvelously mysterious weapon of annihilation. The number of its personnel was greater than had been the town's population at the time when Gaviner had set out on his travels. Hordes of scientists, technicians, brass hats of degree high and low, intelligence officers, highly skilled workmen, and ordinary workmen, all the way up and down the totem pole of importance, were involved in the project's operations. As Violet put it, it was not only great, but the greatest. Not a bit of exaggeration about it. The project's personnel and their families were housed in new little concrete block structures called sunshine houses. And a lot of new businesses, big and little, had sprung up to accommodate their needs and wholesome pleasures. Most of them also named something very cheerful, such as Sweetheart, Rainbow, and Bluebird. One of these new businesses, between big and little, was the Laughing Boy Drive-In, situated on a corner diagonally across from the Pierce family mansion. And this drive-in provoked Gaviner Pierce's sense of personal outrage more strongly than any other vulgarity which had appeared in his hometown during his absence. The drive-in was built on property that belonged to the Pierces. Gaviner's younger brother Braden had leased it for 99 years to a boyhood chum whose portrait in golden neon smiled and laughed out loud with a big ha-ha at 10-second intervals, from early dusk till midnight. And this, mind you, was on the finest residential boulevard in the city, and the haw-hawing neon portrait of its owner was almost directly facing the Pierce mansion. Gaviner, of course, had no misapprehensions about the elegance and dignity of the Pierce place, but the fact remained that Gaviner was a Pierce, and the laughing boy in neon seemed a personal affront. It laughed so loudly that it punctuated all but the loudest passages of the symphonic music he played on his hi-fi at night to calm his nerves. And in addition to the ha-ha at the drive-in, there was the honking of cars from morn to midnight, appealing for immediate servings of such items as king burgers, barbecued ribs, malts, cokes, coffee, and so forth. The car hops were girls, and sometimes they'd lose control of their nerves under the constant pressure of their jobs, and would have screaming fits. Then, more than likely, there'd be the siren wail of an ambulance or squad car, or both. When the hysterical car hop had been rushed off to the Sunshine Emergency Center, the laughing boy would seem to be splitting his sides over the whole bit. And though Gaviner could understand how it all might seem ludicrous in a ghastly way, the mechanical ha-ha somehow would kill the joke, at least for the Prince of the Pierces. Now for a little digression in the nature of turning back time. While Gaviner had been on his travels, he recently received from his mother exactly 2 communications a year, a cablegram at Christmas and a cablegram at Easter, both addressed to him care of American Express in London, a capital that Gaviner visited from time to time to refurbish his wardrobe. These cablegrams were very much to the point. The Christmas one said, "Christ is born. Love, Mother." And the Easter one said, "Christ is risen. Love, Mother." And once, between Christmas and Easter, Gaviner dispatched a cablegram to Mother Pierce that was utterly meaningless to her. It said, "Dear Mother, what is he up to now? Love, Gaviner." However, actually, Mother Pierce's correspondence was far and away more loquacious than these twice-yearly announcements to her traveling son would suggest. And loquacious is the mot juste for it, since all her outgoing letters and wires were shouted to a personal secretary, Little Miss Genevieve Goodley, and shouted is the correct way to put it, as this correspondence was dictated while Mother Pierce was receiving her Vibra Wonder treatment, a very loud, 3-hour treatment that kept her from looking her age by a comfortable margin of give or take a few hours. Now, on this particular morning, to which time has been reversed, a wire had come in from Gaviner, but Mother Pierce ignored all incoming letters and messages till after she'd shouted out to the phenomenal Miss Goodley her outgoing correspondence. And phenomenal is the precise term for Miss Goodley, since she caught every word of this correspondence, even when the Vibra Wonder was operating in the highest of its 5 gears. At this time, on this particular morning, Mother Pierce was shouting out a letter to the most prominent hostess in the nation's capital. "Darling Boo," she shouted, "I am telling you no news that is news to you when I tell you the President and the First Lady with their divine daughter Babe were house guests of mine last weekend. And, oh my soul and body, what fun we girls had together while the menfolk were holding their top-level consultations on the crisis of Gu Gok's shoe. Of course, I already knew from previous get-togethers that the First Lady is more fun than a barrel or a boatload of monkeys. But this last visit was one continual howl. The climax of it was a jamboree at the Club Diamond Breet. I said to Mag, "The ship of state is in responsible hands, so we don't have to worry about it. I want you to know we didn't. Why, honey, while the chief and my precious boy Braden were deciding where to strike next and what to strike with, you would never have guessed from our fun and frolic that anything more serious than a possum hunt was going on anywhere in the world. We had a couple of jazz bands to spell each other. We had the Wildcat Five, which you know are the latest craze. We had a Black You Threw Baseballs ad, and if you hit him, he fell in a tank of cold water. And we had a couple of boxing kangaroos with a dog referee. So, what suddenly happened was this. What suddenly happened but this. The doors bang open at the height of the frolic, and in comes my precious boy Braden pushing the chief in a red, white, and blue wheelbarrow. The chief firing blanks out of 2 pistols. They were like 2 kids who have just burnt down the schoolhouse, and I tell you, honey, the photographers and newspaper boys had a field. They went absolutely hog wild, and the commotion and pandemonium was way, way out of control till all of a sudden the band struck up Babe Stomp in honor of Babe. And Babe shot like a cannonball over to my boy Braden and caught him in such a bear hug that I was scared for a second she'd crack his ribs. "Do my stomp with me, honey," I heard her holler. And off they stomped together. It was a sight to be seen when they accidentally stomped into the honorary co-hostess and knocked her into the pastry end of the buffet table. Then Babe hollered to the band to play a slow number called The Clinch. And, well, you know, Boo, I don't embarrass easy, and it would be hard to find a first lady as up-to-date as Mag is. This is what Mag said to me, Boo. She leaned over to me and said, "Do you see what I see, Nellie? Our 2 children are dancing so tight together you couldn't paste a postage stamp between them. And look at the look in their eyes. I could cry like I do at a wedding." Now, what do you make of that, Boo? I'm sure you must see the tragic irony of it. Poor Violet was never and never could be cut out for her present position in life. I mean, she was suddenly escalated way up beyond her natural limitations, and it would be a happier girl if she had recognized and never overstepped her personal potential. However, what I feel, Boo, is that here is a tragedy that can still be corrected in life. If Braden and Babe have been drawn together by such a powerful attraction to each other, and a little propinquity like this, I think it's the will of God, and we ought to feel morally obliged to do everything we can to bring them together more often. I'm writing you this because you're in a perfect position to throw them together up there. And I can throw them together down here, and believe you me, it would be much harder to hold Babe and Braden apart than it is to get them together. Boo, do you see my point? I know that question is unnecessary, because if you don't see my point, you'd have to be blind as 10 bats in a belfry. Which isn't the case with you, Boo. Your vision and your thinking apparatus have always been up to snuff and a good deal higher. I think just a bit more propinquity at banquets up there and at cookouts and frolics down here will salvage the lives of a pair of fine young people that Providence meant for each other. Now, Boo, keep this under your hat. But if you think my suggestion is as wonderful as I do, get back to me on the teletype right away with one word: wonderful. But if you have any reservations or questions about it, get back to me with the word fog. And, "Oh," cried out Miss Goodley, "my pencil point's broke." "Well, hell," exclaimed Mother Pierce, "what's going on here this morning?" Having never heard her employer speak with such violence before, Miss Goodley rushed sobbing into the bathroom to pull herself together. While she was in there, Mother Pierce completed her Vibra Wonder treatment, and having nothing else to do at the moment, idly picked up a wire which had come in that morning. This wire happened to be from Gaviner. It went as follows: "Dear Mother, I was shocked and sorry to hear that Father has gone to his heavenly mansion. I feel that I ought to be with you in this time of grief and remain as long as necessary to straighten out the unexpected curtailment of my travel expenses. Kill no fatted calf, but expect my homecoming within the next few days. We'll wire the precise time later. Fondest love, Gavinner. God have mercy upon us, cried out Mother Pierce. She had observed that the wire contained no phone number she could call, no address to which she could wire to let the prince know how little she needed his presence to console her in her newly widowed condition. Now, to turn back time more than a little bit further, Gavinner had been on the go since the spring of his 16th year, since the morning in that spring when his tutor companion, the late Dr. Horace Greaves, had convinced Father and Mother Pierce so quickly and easily that their firstborn son, the Prince in the Tower, could be better instructed in the humanities while traveling here and there among foreign lands and seas. The late Dr. Horace Greaves had hardly begun to address the parents on this topic, when the late Mr. Pierce had boomed out, "Fine, wonderful, great, for God's sake, get going." And Mother Pierce had almost simultaneously buzzed the chauffeur to whisk her son and his tutor as fast as a streak of blue lightning out to the airport, and not let them out of his sight till they'd boarded a plane and the plane was off the ground. So began the travels of Gavinner with his tutor companion. Gavinner thrived on these travels, but the tutor companion developed a nervous condition, complicated by insomnia, which culminated in a collapse that was followed by several relapses. And he finally wound up in a Bavarian spa that specialized in the ice cure for nervous disorders. So poor Dr. Greaves was packed in ice for 3 months. His temperature kept at the temperature level of the fish and the lizard. And during that chilly period in the doctor's stoical experience on Earth, Gavinner somehow managed to enlist in the Navy. His hitch in the Navy was remarkably short. It lasted for just 10 days, give or take a few minutes. Then Gavinner was returned to civilian status, and his name and all else pertinent to him was expunged from all records of the naval branch of the armed services, as if he, Gavinner, had never so much as existed. Gavinner then wired Dr. Greaves, "Get off the ice and let's get cracking again." And it just so happened that Dr. Greaves had, that very day the wire reached him, been taken out of the ice. And though the distinguished scholar and educator in the humanities had not yet time to complete out, he was at least as eager as Gavinner to get cracking again, especially toward the equator. 2 things occurred in close sequence to delay the resumption of their travels. And this delay was really more in the nature of a cancellation. One of these occurrences has been mentioned already, the fatal misadventure of Dr. Greaves in the Turtle Bay section of Manhattan, ironically at a farewell banquet on the roof of a 5-story townhouse, a banquet at which the main course and the only course was a species of fungus related to the mushroom, under the influence of which the good doctor took off like a parachute jumper and ended his earthly travels on the inexorable pavement below. However, the second occurrence has yet to be mentioned. It was a bit of information that Gavinner received from a bank official. The information that his father had recently been planted in the family plot, and that the estate had passed into custody of Mother Pierce and the younger son, Braden. This circumstance affected Gavinner gravely, since it meant that his remittances would no longer be adequate to support his former high style of life and travel here and there on the Earth's surface. Gavinner suspected, sensibly, that if he went home for a while, it might not take him too long to convince Mother Pierce and his brother that he, Gavinner, had better be allowed to go on with his travels in the opulent style to which he was accustomed. Though Gavinner's brother was a year younger than Gavinner, Braden Pierce had the maturity of a family man, while Gavinner kept about him a graceful adolescent look, thanks to his slimness and the quality of his skin, so smooth that it seemed to be made without pores, the way that the finest silk shows no sign of being woven. Giviner stayed in the tower of the Greystone mansion, which had been designed to have a sort of pop art resemblance to a medieval castle. He had moved into the tower while he was in his early teens, in order to remove himself as far from the Pierce family life as the geography of the mansion permitted. And he had had an iron fire escape, almost as steep as a stepladder, put between the lawn and a window of the tower, so that his restless comings and goings at night would not disturb the family. They had called him the prince as much in awe as in mockery of his refinements. Braden Pierce had the look that football players get when they have been in business and married for several years. Coarsening, thickening, getting flushed in the face, turning into one of those bullish men who shatter all opposition by the sheer weight and energy of their drive, until drink softens them up at 45 or 50, and the heart quits on them at 60. Right now, Braden was at the peak of his male power. His wife, Violet, had a pale, dampish look in the mornings as if she had spent the night in a steam bath. Their bedroom, unfortunately for Giviner, was directly under his room in the tower, and they made noises like beasts of the jungle when they had sex, which was about every night. At his climax, Braden would howl and curse, and at hers, Violet would cry out like a full yard of peacocks. Apparently, they would also roll and thrash about in their ecstasies, knocking things off their bedside tables. Some nights, Mrs. Pierce would come to their door and call out, "Is something wrong in there? Son, Violet, is something wrong in there?" Neither would answer at once. Violet would be sobbing and making sounds as if she were dying of strangulation, and Braden would be cursing and huffing for a minute or so after Mother Pierce's anxious call at the door. Then at last, they both would answer together in hoarse voices. No, mother, everything's fine. Go on back to bed, mother." One night, a widowed lady and her bachelor son, the Fishers, residents of the house next door, came over for a bridge game that went on after Violet and Braden had gone up to bed. Giviner was in the game because he loved to outwit his mother at bridge. They were playing away when the howling, cursing, and religious and profane exclamations began to reverberate through the castle. Mrs. Pierce kept clearing her throat, and then she asked Giviner to turn the hi-fi on. But Giviner, grinning wickedly, said, "Oh, Mother, I can't concentrate on my game with music playing." "I think," said Mrs. Pierce, but she never completed the statement, for just then some very heavy object, probably Braden, fell to the floor and there was a shower of plaster from the ceiling over the bridge game. The chandelier swung like a pendulum, to exaggerate only slightly. The neighbor lady, Giviner's partner in the bridge game, made repeated coughing sounds, explaining that she had a frog in her throat, while brushing plaster dust off her clothes. Said Mrs. Pierce, with a tight-lipped attempt at a smile. "Partner, I have to pass." Then, being dummy, she got up from the table, murmuring, "Excuse me a moment," and went clattering upstairs to knock at the young couple's door. "Son? Violet." She could be heard calling, and before she could ask if anything was wrong, Braden's voice boomed through the house, bellowing out, "For Christ's sake, will you keep your ass on the bed?" And Violet cried out shrilly, "You're killing me, honey. I'm dying. Let's stay on the floor." Mrs. Pierce's partner, a nervous bachelor in his late 40s, was quite flurried and flushed, since scenes of this nature are particularly embarrassing to Southern boys in the presence of their mothers. He forgot what was trumps. He almost seemed to be putting down cards at random. Nobody said anything after the neighbor lady's announcement that she had a frog in her throat, but she and her son took turns at coughing. Then Giviner began talking out loud, but as if to himself, selecting a subject that seemed to have no relevance to the games upstairs and down. The speech unwound itself evenly from his lips, which wore a smile like Hamlet's or the Mona Lisa's, or rather a bit on the sly side and also a bit on the side of the quietly savage. What he said in this curiously elliptical monologue, under the swaying chandelier, and the continuing shower of dust would never pass the scrutiny of a logician if it were put on paper, where it is now being put as if it came from a tape recorder that had picked up the very free associations of a hallucinated romantic. "Mrs. Fisher," he said, as if he were talking to her, "the course of history changed when a troop of mercenary foot soldiers, equipped with a new weapon called the plopped to their knees among the little wildflowers that sprinkled the morning dew-spangled grass on a certain field in Normandy, I believe, which became known to history as the Field of Agincourt. Mamma, was the bid 5 spades? No, son, it was 6 diamonds, doubled and redoubled before the... Oh. Gaviner went on serenely and illogically, as he played a brilliant game. Yes, he went on. The common foot soldiers didn't pick the wildflowers. Probably didn't notice the wildflowers there, but set their arrows to the strings of their bows and let them fly at a charge of plumed knights in armor. And then something snapped in the clear morning air and was going to stay snapped for the rest of human time. The long bow's arrows struck with appalling accuracy. The charge of the knights was routed. The mercenary foot soldiers rose from the dew-sparkling field, rushed forward and knelt again upon the little wildflowers, and let their arrows go twanging again at the white and silver foe on the field of Agincourt. I suppose it was a little bit like suddenly switching from a game of chess to a game of checkers. I mean the big game of sides against each other in the world. Am I making any sense? I doubt it. But since you're not listening to me, it doesn't make much difference. I used to feel that there was a sort of demented romanticism in this house, being designed to suggest a medieval castle. But the absurdity went too far with the construction of the Laughing Boy Drive-In, catty-cornered across from the fake castle. The last time I was home for a visit, the castle had a banner flying from its tower, a bifurcated triangle of white silk emblazoned with a coat of arms and a motto, Carpe Diem, which means seize the day. All of which makes me suspect that back of the sun and way deep under our feet, at the Earth's center, are not a couple of noble mysteries, but a couple of joke books. However, as for myself, I still go out alone at night and feel something back of the visible stars and something deep under my feet. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just the pleasure of getting a little away from the fake medieval castle and the Laughing Boy Drive-In. Pardon me, said Mrs. Fisher. Did you say something? I was just saying, said Giviner, that every time the earth turns on its axis, a clerk in heaven, some badly paid little clerk, jots down another minus sign after whatever symbol they use for the Quixote syndrome, or whatever the hell they call it in heaven. And I don't know whether the angels burst into weeping or song every time. The neighbor's son spoke up and said, What were you saying, Gaviner? I didn't catch it either. Oh, I was making no more sense than an agnostic priest mumbling mass. But someone had to say something. And so I said that across the street, diagonally across from Pierce's Folly, there is a perfect little gem of neo-colonial architecture that's famous for its barbecued ribs and chicken in a basket and chocolate malts, as thick as fresh cement, and piping hot, ever-fresh coffee. And I'm not a liar when I tell you it makes as much noise, well, nearly as much as Violet and Braden in bed. At least it's that noisy, or nearly, when one shift at the project has sallied forth to make way for the next shift. Let's see now. Doubled, redoubled. And you've lost 7 tricks. What a blow for Mama when she comes back down. The thumping on the floor above was still going on, and the son and mother, the Fishers, had turned from rose red to paper white. But the widow Fisher produced her voice to ask Gaviner again what he was saying while she'd been preoccupied with her cards. "Oh, just babbling," he said. "Just to hear myself babbling. It helps my concentration to babble away playing cards. But when Mother Pierce comes down from her luckless effort to clip the wings of Eros, I'm going to make a suggestion. I'm going to suggest to her that she install a pipe organ in Violet's and Braden's bedroom behind a screen or tapestry. The organist could come in by way of a secret staircase and sliding panel, and whenever Violet and Braden retire before guests have left the castle, the organist could play the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah or Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries." Oh, there goes Violet like a yard full of peacocks. And now Braden's howling like a villain wrestler with his foot being twisted. Marvelous, yes. When I was in the Navy for several days, I made the acquaintance of another recruit who showed me a photo of his baby and said, "I made that baby the night I pushed the wall with both feet, man." Now it seems like they've withdrawn to reorganize their forces, and Mother Pierce is coming back downstairs. Whose deal is it? Oh, mine. And I've already dealt while you all were paying no attention to my wandering reflections. Mother Pierce came back into the room, saying, "Well, well, well," in a loud, cheerful tone at total variance, with a sharpshooter blaze in her eyes. "What was going on, Mother?" asked Gaviner. "Why, nothing at all to speak of. They were just romping and cutting up like a couple of kids when school lets out." "Oh. Now, isn't that sweet?" said the widow from next door in a toneless voice. "Partner, have we finished rubber? Yes?" inquired Mother Pierce. "Why don't we settle the score and have a round of nightcaps for the road?" "Mother," suggested Gaviner, "why don't we all trot over to the drive-in for a basket of chicken and French fries, since it's so close, so handy?" "Now, Gaviner," said Mother Pierce, "you'll have to get used to the drive-in when you're home from your travels. It's going to be on that corner for 99 years at least." "You mean barring a premature blast at the project?" Gaviner murmured. Then he added louder, "Mama, we beat you again. So before you make those nightcaps, shell out 86 in greenbacks and 47 in quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies, since my partner and I will not accept your check or an IOU." He had already risen from the card table and tossed about his shoulders a white silk scarf that was almost the size of a bedsheet and as flawlessly smooth as his skin. And now he was putting on a black topcoat, which his bridge partner, the next-door widow, touched with incredulous fingers and said, "Why, that coat is—" She was going to say "moi," when there came a call at the door, a voice calling out, "Delivery from the drive-in." Gaviner said, "Speak of the devil." This delivery from the drive-in was, as always, 2 orders of chicken in the basket with French fries. That's what Braden always called for when he and Violet had chalked up one more vigorous assault on the huge and dark siege of inertia that can be said to hang about the dynamics of existence. To put it in somewhat or more than somewhat rhetorical fashion. Just what Braden felt when he had completed one of those furious assaults on the siege of inertia is a question that would have to be put to Braden, and it is doubtful that he would come up with a coherent answer if he tried to give one. The likeliest guess is that he felt like a rooster on a back fence at the sign of daybreak. Anyway, one thing is certain. While Braden was still panting from his orgasm, he would pick up the bedroom phone and call the drive-in. "Hey, Billy." "The same," he would say. Violet would always say, "No French fries for me." But Braden would ignore this interjection since a double portion of French fries had never fazed him. At his end of the line, Billy would say, "Right over, man, right over." This delivery from the drive-in was always delivered personally by the proprietor himself. The laughing boy, Billy, would carry the 2 piping hot baskets straight up to the Braden Pierce's bedroom, and he would often stay up there about an hour, having nightcaps with Violet and Braden, and reminiscing with Braden about the spectacular tricks and pranks of their boyhood days and nights, such as the Halloween they went in the colored graveyard and dug up a preacher buried the day before, and put him and his coffin side by side on the steps of his church, along with a big printed sign nailed onto the coffin which said, "They wouldn't let me in heaven, so I come back to preach some more about hell to you sinful blacks next Sunday." Oh, those were real fun days and nights in their boyhood. And Braden and Billy would assure each other that they were not over yet. No, sir. Not by a long shot. You could bet on that. One time, Braden said to Billy, "I'll tell you something, buddy. But you forget what I told you. Buddy, there's a big Halloween yet to be, but the pranks and the jokes are such classified information, as they call it, that I wouldn't dare even to talk about them to you. And that's no shit. But this I can say. We've got a color TV. And on this color TV, buddy, the blacks and the yellows are coming in so loud and clear that they're burning our eyeballs over at the project. That much I can tell you because you're not a heavy drinker that repeats whatever he hears like a goddamn parrot. I can tell you, this big Halloween's coming up. It's necessary, like breathing. And after this Halloween, what we're dreaming of at the project, man, is a white Christmas. And that white hot snow is going to fall out of heaven and be as hot as all hell. That much I can tell you. And I tell you no lie, and I want you to remember I told you something I wouldn't tell my wife unless she was lying there sleeping dead to the world. Do you dig me? On that particular night, when the privileged boyhood chum of Braden's went back to close up the drive-in, he had a religious feeling. He felt like he'd been to church and God had delivered the sermon. This boyhood chum of Braden's, who was still such a chum despite the wildly different positions to which fate had assigned them, was named Spangler, Billy Spangler, a lively-sounding name which suited the bearer. It was just a couple of weeks after Givenner's return to the bosom of his family, so to speak, that he had his first encounter with Billy. It came about in this way. Givenner did not have wheels of his own at this time, but Violet had graciously turned over to him her caddy convertible, which was violet color to go with her name. And one fine autumn morning, Givenner impulsively entered the drive of the drive-in, for which he had almost an obsessive distaste. He drove into the drive-in without any conscious purpose. He didn't acknowledge to himself that he was intensely curious about Braden's boyhood chum, who had that optimistic 99-year lease on a corner practically facing the Pierce Castle. Givenner nearly always came on like a cool one, despite having a nervous system that kept spitting off hot sparks under his skin, as though constantly celebrating a Chinese festival. The late Dr. Horace Greaves had taught Givenner the secret of outward serenity, but his pupil had surpassed the good doctor, who would have to go into a state of samadhi when passing through customs in foreign air or seaports. The good doctor's samadhi, a trance-like condition known to Hindu mystics and their disciples, was probably synthetic, since he could enter a customs shed with apparent dreamlike composure, but was apt to go to pieces if a customs officer inquired into the nature of a certain pills and vials that were tucked away in his luggage. Then he would come out of samadhi and go directly into something close to hysteria. But Givenner would lean across the customs counter and say to the officer, "My uncle is a saintly man not long for this world, so please don't excite him." No, Givenner was not a cool one, and yet he could do things that were very disturbing to him, and do them with apparent serenity. And so he was able to drive directly up to the entrance of the Laughing Boy Drive-In as smoothly as if he lived there. Violet's Caddy convertible had 3 silver trumpets for announcing itself in traffic. The trumpets had 3 different musical notes. Gay Venner blew them, and Billy Spangler heard them. He recognized the car at once as Violet Pierce's violet-colored caddy, and noticed at once that there was, at the wheel, a young man he had not seen before. He thought he ought to step out of the drive-in to have a closer look at this young man who looked like a boy. He no sooner had this thought than he put it into action and stepped out a pace or 2 from the door. Then Gay Venner had a look at Billy while Billy had a look at him. What Gay Venner saw was a young fellow more than ordinarily good-looking, with a figure that was lean except for the shoulders, which were so heavily muscled that they seemed cramped by this mess jacket of his snowy white uniform. It was a fair-weather day, and Billy Spangler seemed to be matching part of the weather. His eyes, looking at Gay Venner, had a totally open, above-board, and straightforward look. He looked like a young man who had never had an arrière-pensée in all his life. A young man who started performing an act a second or 2 before it consciously occurred to him. A young man whose appearance seemed still to reflect, joyfully, the tricks and pranks of his boyhood. Gay Venner was not disarmed by the glowing fair-weather artlessness of Billy's appearance. No, not at all. In fact, there was something in the way Billy looked and smiled at him that set off sparklers and spit devils in Gay Venner's nervous system. A scorching reminder of various irreconcilables in his nature. Just then, the screen door sprang open and out rushed a girl car hop with such momentum that she collided with the back of Billy, let out a screeching laugh, and stumbled back against the screen door, exclaiming, "Well, excuse me." Gay Venner paid no attention to that little accident, but leaned a bit out of Violet's car and said to Billy, as slowly and precisely as if he were speaking to a retarded child, "I would like to have a cup of black coffee, please. Just black. No cream and no sugar and no toast or pastry with it." "Okay," said Billy. Then he turned to the girl who was still against the screen door as if impaled there and said, "Did you get that, honey?" She gasped, "Yes," and scrambled back to the drive-in. Billy looked up and about him and shouted, "Fine day!" Gay Venner made no comment on it. Then the girl exploded back out of the drive-in with an aluminum tray on which were a cup of piping hot coffee, a china creamer, 2 little fluted paper sugar containers, and a glass of ice water. As she brushed past Billy on her way to the car, she let out another hysterical cry. Billy followed behind her toward the car, walking behind her leisurely and observing her hips in her skin-tight gabardine slacks, the color of white coffee. She got to the car and couldn't attach the tray to the door because her fingers shook so. But Billy came up tolerantly beside her and fastened the tray himself. Then he looked down into Gay Venner's face and smilingly inquired, "Ain't that Mrs. Braden Pierce's new caddy you're driving there, son?" He did not say it exactly as though he were accusing Gay Venner of stealing the car, but it was apparent that he was one of the many people who sucked up to Braden. Gay Venner's first dislike of the drive-in owner was a reflection of his dislike of his brother, and he ignored the question, coolly disregarded the amiably inquiring eyes, and said to the girl, "How long has this place been here?" The girl answered nervously, feeling his hostile vibration. She answered in the heavy drawl of the back country. She was freckled. All her features were too small, and she had on too much eye pencil and lipstick. But her breasts, under the cream-colored silk blouse and the plushiness of her bottom, made it disgustingly plain to Gay Venner why this new young buck who owned the drive-in had hired her. She said, "About 6 months, I think," and her hand shook as she set the ice water glass down again, after removing the napkin underneath it and giving it to Giviner. "Well," said Giviner, "it's really a shame to put up a thing like this in a residential district." He said this in a voice that shook like the girl's hand as she set the water glass down. She didn't answer. She made a small noise in her throat and turned quickly away and started back to the little colonial-style building. But Billy Spangler heard the remark as clearly as Giviner had intended him to hear it, and he did not follow the girl back into the drive-in, but stood, leaning easily on the front fender of the new Caddy, glancing lazily back at the girl's hips again as she entered the shiny copper screen door. But then returning his steady gaze to the reddening face of Giviner. He took his time about responding to Giviner's attack on his place, and the response that he made was quite... "What," he said, "is your objection to this drive-in?" "It belongs on the highway," said Giviner. "I thought about the highway," said Billy Spangler, "but this is a lot more convenient for the people that work down there at the project." He nodded down the street which the Pierce residence was facing, and which led directly up to the project. One of Giviner's great regrets was that intense anger always clouded his mind, so that he seldom could think of an immediate and effectually cutting reply to a remark that angered him. Also, at such times, his voice was always unsteady. Sometimes he even stammered, and so he often had to hold his tongue and to boil inside while he held it. This anger was so intense that at times he felt as though he were on the verge of an epileptic seizure. Now he could not return the look of Billy Spangler, nor answer his calm speech, nor even lift the coffee cup from the saucer. He was altogether immobilized for possibly half a minute or more while Billy Spangler stared at him and leaned on the caddy's front fender. All he could do was boil and look down at the coffee while Spangler leisurely went on talking in the same unruffled voice about the advantages of the drive-in's location. "You know," he said, "they're doing a mighty big and important job down there at the project. I don't pretend to know exactly what, and I guess it ain't a good thing to be too curious about it unless you're actually in it. But I know from the little I've seen or heard that the whole future security of this country is mixed up with it. Naturally, there's got to be some changes in this town that don't suit everybody. Like business places cropping up where there used to be private houses, and smoke in the air and crowded housing conditions, and so many people at the movies you have to stand in line to buy a ticket, and then wait again to get a seat. But all in all, this here is a fast-moving town with business booming. Like Mr. Pierce over there. He's got more different jobs than you can shake a stick at. Not just jobs, but the top executive positions. The most important is being in charge of personnel at the plant. But he's sitting on practically every other board or organization in this town. And he's a guy that anybody can talk to. Drops by here every day, even if it's just to smile and wave to somebody. And I know he don't have no objection at all to this here drive-in. In fact, I know he likes it. I know he likes it because he told me so himself, and he leased me the piece of land that the drive-in's built on." It was then at this point that Giviner flew into action. He came unknotted all at once, and he threw the car into gear and started it off before Billy Spangler could even remove his elbow from the fender, so that Spangler was almost knocked off balance and his shoulder was struck by the aluminum tray that was still attached to the rolled-down window of the convertible. He shouted, "Hey!" and Giviner heard him running along the gravel as if he thought he might overtake the car. But Giviner did not glance back. He did not even pause to properly remove the tray and its contents, just pushed them off the side of the car as he raced it around the corner on 2 wheels. There were, of course, repercussions to the incident at the Laughing Boy Drive-In. That evening, Braden came storming up to Giviner's little apartment in the tower. Billy Spangler just come over with some fried chicken for me and Violet, and he told me his shoulder was sore. I asked him what was wrong with his shoulder, and he said he didn't want to tell me, but he finally did. He said you went over there today to complain about the drive-in. You hit his shoulder with a tray when you drove out and pitched the tray in the crockery in the street. Now, I'd like you to tell me what the shit is the meaning of a thing like this. Oh, said Givenner coolly. I believe that the Laughing Boy gave a reasonably accurate report on the incident at the drive-in this morning. But as for the meaning of it, perhaps it just means that Mother and you should not have reduced my travel allowance, but kept it at the same level or even increased it. Givenner had his back turned to his brother and was ostensibly engaged in cataloging his big collection of phonograph records, most of which were rare collector's items. Now look here, Prince. Yes? Listen to what I'm telling you for your own good. Nobody comes in this town, not even my brother, without being known and observed and classified by the Security Council at the project. I mean, all unfamiliar persons and types coming here are classified by the new automation system under 3 headings: good, doubtful, or bad, as security risks. The automation system and the intelligence office check and double check and triple check on every newcomer here or anywhere near here. And here's something else for you to know for your own good. New legislation is being pushed through at high speed for the isolation of all you don't-fit inners. And that word isolation can mean several things, none of which things is pleasant for the isolated individual, Prince. There is too much at stake, too much pending on a worldwide scale for the toleration of temperamental flare-ups and artistic hoopla. So here's what you do tomorrow. When I go to the project, I'll drop you by the drive-in. You go in there and offer an apology to my friend Billy Spangler. You apologize to him and shake hands with him and pay him for the crockery you broke up. That's what you do in the morning. And face the fact right now that there's got to be some of you don't-fit inners for a while only. Just for a little while till they can be weeded out of society in progress. But you are overdoing that privilege, which is pro tem only. Understand what I'm saying? Perfectly, said Givenner, still coolly. But I would suggest that you save yourself the possible embarrassment of having a brother named Givenner in isolation. Whatever, wherever that is, by arranging with Mother for the restoration of my traveling allowance to its former level, or a little higher to meet the inflation problem. Braden's answer to that was a remark in the nature of obscenity, and the conversation between the brothers was permanently finished. Alone in his tower that night, Givenner opened a window and stood there listening to the faint, perpetual hum of activity at the project. It moved through the air like the purring of some giant cat that never slept, nor changed its menacingly crouched position. For the first time in his life, as best as he could remember, Givenner thought about good and evil. It seemed to him that he knew coldly, abstractly, which of the two was which, and also knew which of the two it would suit him better to serve in whatever way it was possible for him to serve it. He felt a vibration in himself, like a counter-vibration to the one that came from the project. I'm being silly, he thought. All I'm here for is to blackmail Mother and Braden into giving me back my travel expenses. What has good and evil got to do with that? But he stayed at the window, and the feeling of 2 dueling vibrations continued. Went the project. Went Givenner. And it seemed like an equal conflict. It gave him the sort of strength that a barefooted Hopi, treading bare ground in a dance, is said to draw up out of the blazing dark core of the earth.